Hi, I'm Jen Smith, the Program Director for Grow New York, a food and ag startup competition administered by Cornell University's Center for Regional Economic Advancement that attracts innovation to the food and ag community in upstate New York, a region that's defined by its robust agriculture and farming and food communities. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayogono. The Gayogono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with an historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayogono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayogono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. The Grow New York competition supports early stage startups with innovation that provide critical solutions to catalyze large scale change. We plan to open applications for our 4th $1 million top prize competition in May. Startups working at any point in the agri-food system from anywhere in the world are encouraged to apply. You can sign up for our newsletter at www.grow-ny.com to learn when the applications open. For idea stage innovations, we also offer an ag tech hardware prototyping accelerator. Applications for this year's cohort, which starts in May, are open through the end of this week. And you can learn more following the link that's going to be dropped in chat. That's really to take your ideas from back of the envelope noodling through to prototype. Today's panel conversation will be moderated by my colleague, Alan Martinez from Cornell's Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Alan will give a full definition of what we're talking about when we talk about regenerative agriculture. Alan pulled me in on a promising project addressing regenerative agriculture adoption in our region that he'll tell you more about. But for now, let's say that regenerative agriculture is an approach that leaves farms in better shape after harvest than before, that increases overall farm resilience and productivity, and that addresses the climate crisis through on-farm operations. Alan's project represents a promising approach to increasing the adoption of regenerative agriculture practices, which is in line with Grow New York goals. In our Call for Innovation report, we'll drop the link in chat, New York's farmers and agriculture researchers identified the urgent need for tools to help them adapt to climate change and tools to help them mitigate it as well. You can reach the report through the link in the chat. And now I'll turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, Jen, and hi, everyone. I'm Alan. Jen, thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. This week, we celebrate Earth Day, and I can't think of a better way to celebrate than to join our guest in a special and focused conversation on the whys and hows of regenerative agriculture. Here at Cornell, I co-lead projects and partnerships that move sustainability research into action through the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. And I get to do that through collaboration with an amazing group of faculty fellows from across the university and external organizations. So I am really excited to be here with you all today. Over the last 15 months, one of those projects supported by the Great Lakes Protection Fund began exploring innovative financial solutions to support the adoption of these practices that restore and maintain the water integrity of the Great Lakes. And through this project, we have taken a deep dive into the world of regenerative agriculture. Today, we are going to go deep, and we're going to talk to 3 individuals who are at the heart of the conversation on how agriculture can impact and support sustainability goals. Our special guests for this conversation are AJ Kumar, Senior Director of Carbon Science and Modeling at Indigo, which is an ag tech company that is perhaps best known for accelerating the conversation on carbon credits in agriculture. Megan Hauser is the owner of Table Rock Farm, a dairy in Western New York, which last year received New York State's AEM Leopold Conservation Award. The award honors farmers for their efforts to protect the environment through the preservation of soil and water quality. And finally, Scott Day. Scott is the Director of Agronomy at Fall Line Capital, a $300 million agriculture investment fund based, interestingly enough, in Silicon Valley. However, today he joins us from the province of Manitoba in Canada. Scott is a fifth-generation farmer with experience in agriculture extension and has been recognized for his support of no-till agriculture. So before inviting our guests to join me in this conversation, I thought it would be helpful to share a few slides with you to answer the one question that 263 of the 263 individuals that we have talked to have consistently asked us. And that is simply, what is regenerative agriculture? Fortunately, we weren't, can't really see the slides here, Chris, but I'm hoping that you're at a slide where we're showing the how people have looked at the outcomes of this work. Researchers at the University of Colorado Boulder did a comprehensive review of the term from both a researcher and a practitioner perspective, looking at hundreds of articles and combing through practitioner websites to catalog the features most mentioned when using the term. Concluding, unfortunately for us, that there is indeed not a consensus or a common definition, but giving us some important signposts. The first of which is that among practitioners, there is overwhelming consensus that regenerative agriculture is about improving soil health outcomes. Carbon sequestration is also seen as an important part of the regenerative agriculture movement. But then we start to see less consensus, but certainly interest in the positive outcomes on biodiversity, water health, and social and economic well-being. The next slide shows you a number of practices associated with regenerative agriculture. Another encouraging signpost for us, because so many of these practices are associated with regenerative agriculture and have proven track records. And we know that, with our friends and colleagues in Cornell Cooperative Extension, as well as extension teams across the country, we are seeing the promotion of these conservation practices of reduced tillage, cover crops, crop rotation, integrating livestock, and minimizing external inputs. Which brings us to our working definition, articulated a few years ago by General Mills, one of the earliest corporates to make regenerative agriculture commitments, and modeled very closely to soil health principles, which many of our researchers at Cornell helped to pioneer. This seems to be a definition that the private sector is coalescing around, a definition based on principles with a focus on outcomes and a definition about a farmer's individual journey to greater sustainability impact. So with that working definition in mind, I, together with my co-principal investigator, John Tobin, perhaps the world's leading authority on conservation finance, set out to explore how incentives and financial solutions could help us accelerate regenerative agriculture adoption, especially in the Great Lakes watershed. And this is the work that set the ball rolling for us to reach out to stakeholders like today's guests, to explore new solutions, and importantly, to move our research into action. We can't go into the details today. I know there are a number of links that we're going to share with you, but if you're interested, reach out. We're happy to share more. So with the little table setting out of the way, why are we hearing more and more about the role of agriculture in supporting sustainable outcomes? I want to do away with the slides and really focus on our guests and hear more about them, their work, their organizations. And AJ, maybe I can start with you and ask you to kick us off here to tell us a little bit more about Indigo, your business model, and the outcomes you seek to achieve through your work.
Great. Thank you, Alan, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Indigo, as you mentioned, we're an agriculture technology company, and our mission is to harness nature to help farmers sustainably feed the planet. And, we started with that mission a little over 7 years ago at this point, and it's sort of evolved us as a company through various business offerings. And it was about 3 years ago that we really sort of saw the potential and really sort of began deep work on the potential for carbon as a new crop that we could, create with, some of these practices that you mentioned on the previous slide, where we, could quantify, using the latest science, what was going on and help deliver a new stream of income for farmers in the farming community, as well as help incentivize more adoption of these practices and help really create a new market.
Thanks, AJ. Megan, as a multi-generational farm, Table Rock is continuing a legacy, and the recognition, for those of you that don't know, the Leopold Award is the gold standard in conservation farming. And so congratulations. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about that journey and then the why behind the way that you farm. A few milestones, or just give us a sense of how you approach and why you approach farming in this way.
Okay, sure, Alan. I'm going to do a little table setting myself, if it's okay, and tell just a little bit more about our farm, if that's a good start.
Super.
Okay, super. So our farm is in Wyoming County, and for people that are know Ithaca, that's about 2 hours west of Ithaca. We're nestled right against Letchworth Park. Was voted the #1 New York State park in the nation a few years ago. So it's become increasingly well known and well visited in our area. In fact, an original part of the farm, 90 acres, is now part of Letchworth Park because we adjoined right down to the gorge of the Genesee River. So we're very cognizant and aware that there are lots of people looking at our farm all the time. So Table Rock employs 35 people, and I work alongside them to milk and care for our 1,200 cows. We are also cropping 1,800 acres to feed those cows. So we want our cows to eat as locally as possible. And so that accounts for about 60% of their feed is grown within 5 miles of the farm. We've been farming here since 1915. And the farm today is the culmination, when you're asking about the timeline of the farm, it's the culmination really of generations working together to build those core ethics of what it means to be Table Rock, of how we care for the cows and how we farm the land. When you talk about regenerative agriculture, you and I have talked about this, that's a new term for me and for a lot of farmers, but really it's talking about something that we've been doing for a very long time, which is how do we do our best to build those healthiest soils? First, we want to have healthy soil so we can feed our cows. Our cows are taking food that is not usable for humans, silages, corn stalks, food that would have not been acceptable, say bakery waste, and making it into a foodstuff for people to eat, which is, I think, a wonderful thing. It's one of the things I love is that we are making nutritious food for people by taking food that couldn't be used any other way. The other thing cows make when they're making that wonderful, nutritious food is manure. What is the cool thing about manure? That it's the perfect fertilizer for those soils. So we have this kind of virtuous cycle going on of dairy farming. The cows are making the fertilizer that we put back into the soil to make it healthy, to make the crops grow well. So that's a really cool part of farming. As far as the cycle and how this started, it was over 20 years ago. And it wasn't the management saying, my dad or my granddad saying, this is what we need to do. Really, we had an employee who had been on the farm a number of years. He's still there now. He's been at the farm for 47 years now. And if you're talking to dairy farmers, he's like, well, I only farm part-time, which means in the winter he takes off, but in the summer he's there all the time. And he went to a meeting and he got introduced to this book, which Harold Van Ness wrote, about better soils. And he came back and said, this is what we need to do on our farm. And you can imagine that it took a lot of convincing. You just don't come back and say, this is what we're going to do. It took a lot of convincing on his part to get everyone in tune. But what a huge thing to do. So over 20 years ago, we got rid of our plow, we sold it, and began working towards minimal till and then no till to grow the crops that we want. And I love that it was a kind of bottom up thing saying this is what we need to do. And that's one of, again, the ethics of Table Rock is anyone can come with that good idea and say, this is what we need to do to change to be better. Because if we don't have a great team with great brains all working together, we're not going to get anywhere. So That's kind of the basis of the story. It's probably more than you wanted, Alan.
That's a great start. I think that's a really great start. And thank you for mentioning Harold Van Ness and so many of the researchers at Cornell and faculty at Cornell that have really helped to pioneer the work of soil health and other important conservation practices. Scott, I do want to turn to you and kind of share. I often feel like I'm traversing so many different worlds in this work, from finance to farming and boardrooms. You do this in an amazing way, both professionally, having gone from farming to extension to investing, but also physically. The last time I saw you, you were in the Arctic tundra of Canada, but you were moving from San Francisco. And so I'm sure others want to know a lot more about your work and the role of Fall Line.
Yeah, so my career in farming started, as a young kid growing up on our own farm, but I started.
We lost Scott, unfortunately. We'll hold off and maybe he'll join us in a second. Yeah, there he is.
If you're waiting, Alan, I could talk about something else that's been really important to us in this process.
I think we're back.
Okay.
There we are. Is this something that's happening with everyone, that the video is cutting out? Okay. Yeah. So I started. I bought some farmland in the late 80s, and on the same day I was offered a job as an extension agent. So my two careers started on the same day. And I was very fortunate to be an extension agent in my home community. And I was young and I got involved in soil conservation. And I had some great mentors that were part of the revolution of no-till across the world. The Manitoba North Dakota Zero-Till Association was really the first major group. They published no-till manuals that are in 15 different languages. And I got to be a part of that as a young farmer. And so I incorporated no-till and conservation farming methods on my own farm. And then I ended up getting all these opportunities to speak, because here I was, a farmer, putting my money where my mouth was, and an extension agent trying to encourage change. And I ended up speaking in many different parts of the world. And at one point I was speaking at all the no-till events in Australia about how biotech impacts our ability to no-till, how it's very positive to our ability to no-till. And I met a farmer from Iowa there, Clay Mitchell, who has an agronomy master's from Cornell. Clay is a precision ag expert from Iowa, and we were speaking at the same conferences, and we became friends. And a few years later, when he decided that it would be great to create a farmland investment company, I was one of the first employees. But I wasn't looking to change my career. I was happy where I was, so I have a hybrid life where I live in the Bay Area in the wintertime, working out of our head office. And in the summers, I live in Manitoba and continue to Oh, it says it's losing us. So,
you might have just
can you hear me? Does that work?
We can, Scott. Yes, we can.
Yeah. So for the last 10 years, I have been living in the Bay Area in the wintertime, and I live in Manitoba and farm there. And our investment company, Fall Line Capital, focuses on the purchase of farmland in the United States that we can then develop with further, irrigation, no-till implementation, new crops, and that sort of thing to realize full potential. But we also invest in technology that impacts conservation ag and farming in general. And that's the basis of the company. And I continue to get to practice some of these techniques on my own farm.
Well, let's talk a little bit about practice. Megan, maybe we can come back to you for a second, because the part of this is kind of thinking about what are the outcomes we're trying to reach, but then we have to think about practically, how do you actually get there? And you started to describe your journey. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about, we've found 40 practices that farms can adopt to create regenerative agriculture systems on their farms. I'm curious how you started. You mentioned no-till, but I think you've been doing some other, clearly more even more innovative stuff more recently. And I'm curious if you would just tell us, how do you choose what to change, and and how do you take on the risk related to changing something on a farm?
Okay, that's a great question. So partially, how do we make a decision to take on a risk? We have a few different methods, Alan. First of all, we're surrounded by great other dairy farmers. So sometimes if something seems really risky, it's really great to see one of your neighbors take it on, see what they do, if you don't want to take that big leap. But another great tool we have is super advisors. So for example, we're working with Western New York Crop Management, which is a team of trained professionals that basically help us look at what we're doing and make good decisions. So take information about our farm that they collect, data about the soil health, the soil fertility, about our manures, our fertilizer, natural fertilizers, makeup, and how to use that. So we're getting advice there and ideas about new things to do. And then we have super advisors through groups like Cornell. Cornell Cooperative Extension for us and Cornell University is an invaluable tool. They are doing research on our farm every year. We see the actual results of that research and we can see whether it works or not. And then we can talk to other farmers about that. We get that information. They come on our farm, or my team feels as comfortable as I do talking with Cornell researchers, which I think is a great thing. And then we think about taking those risks. We often do another Cornell tool, which is a partial budget, to look through and say, does this make sense? Can we make this pay back in 1 year, 5 years, things like that? So not only Cornell Cooperative Extension, New York State Soil and Water, American Farmland Trust, there's a lot of groups that have done studies on our farm and helped us make those kind of decisions. So we're so fortunate to have those advisors, as well as that team of professionals on our own farm that are always curious and innovative.
Well, thank you for that, Megan. And I'm curious, AJ, Megan mentioned it a little bit, the issue of just getting the right data from farms. I'm curious because I think you have a treasure trove of data, and without revealing too much that might be confidential, what can you tell us about practice adoption, either locally, regionally, nationally, from the perspective that you're seeing, and what pockets of promise can you talk about in terms of resolving some of the data challenges in carbon sequestration or just practice adoption generally?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. And I think if you zoom out to the national level, you say at the local level, there are certain pockets where I think around Megan and some place where Scott was working, where you've got great adoption of certain practices already. But at the national level, there's still a huge room. If you look like I think the NAS Ag Census from 2017, we were at about 37% adoption of no-till in that, no-till or sort of reduced till, and then only 5.6% adoption of cover crops as a practice. If you dig in a little on that no-till side, the actual fraction of the actual amount of people that are doing continuous no-till is a fraction of that amount. And so we see that there's, at a national scale, a huge opportunity here. One of the things that we're bringing technology to bear here is, with remote sensing, with satellites, and with training, we don't have to wait for that ag census every, several years. We can actually detect at a national scale what's going on and where are the hotspots. And to the point Megan raised, how can we help foster these networks and bring these voices so they're not just helping influence their neighbor, but the national stage. And so we've tried to create new content and information that we can share so that farmers around the country can learn from each other, and try to make these resources available for folks so that from our side we're not just collecting the data and sort of helping understand what is the greenhouse gas impact, but also how can we help those folks in our program be successful at implementing what they're doing. And I'll drop a couple of links into the chat here about, one of the things we've offered is what we call our Carbon College, which is a course you can take online, and some of them actually you can get if you're a certified crop advisor, can get continuing education credits for some of those as well.
Great. No, thank you, AJ. And similarly, Scott, with a portfolio, maybe I think it's half of your portfolio is farmland. And I'm just curious, how do you look at adoption and experimentation on the farm for sustainability in particular? how do you ensure positive contribution?
Right. Yeah, we have farmland in kind of 3 distinct regions in the United States, and they're in those regions because that's where the deals were. That's where farmland values and opportunities made sense. And you have to be practical and adaptive to whatever the region is. So our ultimate goal is preserving or enhancing the topsoil. That's the focus of our thesis. And so we require cover crops. We don't operate the farms ourselves. We work with local farmers to operate the farms, but we want to be as involved as practical with the management of the property. So we require cover crops in certain conditions. We require to reduce tillage in certain conditions. But in the South, for instance, in the Delta regions, there's not a lot of cover crop, although there's a lot of opportunity for that. So we're looking at new and novel crops to grow in the wintertime. Instead of a cover crop, it works like a cover crop, but it could be a source of income rather than just a cover crop. In other areas, we're looking at trying to introduce some new crops that make reduced tillage more possible. They present less residue, break up rotations. And then in the Pacific Northwest, we have potato farmers that it's impossible to grow potatoes without tillage, but they are keen on working with us, and they have to incorporate a cover crop immediately after harvest. And in some cases, we have potato growers that are now incorporating a lot more residue in their potato year and doing that with success. So you have to look at each situation and each farm and see what's possible, and not have a set template, because that's not going to work. And our ultimate goal with the topsoil is pretty straightforward. It's just which tools and activities you're going to focus on depending on the region.
Yeah, and to your point too, Scott, it has to change every year, because this is a wet year, or this is a dry year. Or this year, if April is extremely cold, we haven't been really able to get on the field yet. So saying the cover crops have to change depending on where the location of the farm is, it's also just, what are we dealt this year?
Yeah. And where I farm personally in Western Canada, our company doesn't own farmland outside the US, but where I live in Western Canada, it's virtually 100% no-till, 1,000 kilometers across the prairies. And we grow a wide variety of crops like sunflowers and soybeans and dry beans. So when I'm in the South talking, what crops I grow, they're often like, how do you no-till? You're too cold up there. And I'm like, well, it actually works quite well. So it helps me being, trying to advise people that I have this experience with these crops, and I have done it in a climate that can be as extreme as anywhere.
That's really, really interesting. I do want to ask you a little bit more, Scott, about the international side of your work. And I guess you're suggesting that it's not farmland. There are companies that you're investing in, both in the United States and abroad. Let's move into this question of how do we make more of this happen? And I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of technology or innovation that is important to enable the kind of work or the kind of practice adoption that we're looking for.
Essentially, there's been an explosion in interest and resources for ag tech investing. The World Ag Tech Summit was in San Francisco last month. I think it was 3 times larger than the last time it was held a couple of years before. And so you have money that's looking to invest in ag tech because there's obvious opportunities there. This connection to agriculture with the money is kind of rare. And that's where we are at an advantage, where there are a couple of farmers that are the people that are making the decisions on what technology to invest in. And we have 22 investments over 10 years, and they're all still alive, which is kind of rare in venture capital. And I think that comes from our perspective as a producer when we're looking at new tech. As far as how do we make this happen, I think there's this whole ecosystem that has grown rapidly around ag tech, and these events that are occurring, various incubators that are popping up. And I think if there is a new idea that is looking for financing, there is many avenues in which to pursue that at this point. And it's hard to get into specifics because it's so broad, but it's interesting that like places like Tel Aviv is a hotbed for ag tech. Boston, Research Triangle, St. Louis, Silicon Valley, those are hotbeds. University of Saskatchewan is a hotbed. University of Guelph is a hotbed. University of Sydney in Australia is a hotbed for, when I say hotbed, it's where a lot of ideas are coming out of or are going to be evaluated. And there's places like Reykjavik and other places in Europe that are kind of interesting sources of new ag tech. And the amount of, we review 3 to 4 companies a day, probably at this point, either, passively or reaching out. Yesterday, we evaluated a company that can treat mastitis without antibiotics using the same technology that destroys kidney stones. I thought that was very interesting. And then we're looking at new RNA technology for replacing all the pesticides we have now.
Right. Well, a part of that ecosystem is indigo, and I'm curious, AJ, if you could kind of talk about, as you try to get more farmers to do this practice adoption, how do you work with them to think about the risk mitigation efforts? I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that farmers face is how am I going to change something that's been working for us and try this new thing that might have some bonus, but it might be a few years down the road.
Yeah, that's, one of the things that we do is really work closely with partners, and it means working not just with the growers directly, but also with, their trusted advisors with, we have partnerships with some large co-ops, such as Growmark and Landis out in Iowa and Illinois. And, these are folks that have that sort of trusted advisor relationship with the growers. So we can equip them with information on, okay, well, if I want to do cover crops, how can I avoid, if I'm worried about moisture, okay, what's the best way to manage that? Like, how do I dip my toe in without, risking too much? And we can help sort of think through this. And we've actually also created some digital tools around this, in terms of, saying based on where I am, what my goals are, sort of what I'm willing to try out. Okay, what's the right cover crop for my area? What's my, so cover crop selection tool, this kind of decision support tooling. And then also breaking into that, essentially, some idea of what's the profitability impact, because the carbon credit is a value you can get right now for that impact. But there's actually, as I'm sure Megan and Scott can say way better than I, there's way more co-benefits that you can get from adopting these practices that actually also impact your bottom line in a positive way over time. So we try to help stack all that, make that information available to folks and connect them with local resources that can help them be successful.
Well, let's talk about those co-benefits, Megan. I love learning more about your farm and kind of seeing some of the benefits that you talk about that we might not ever think about, like cow comfort. But can you tell us about the range of benefits that you look at as kind of giving you confidence that this is worthwhile, that some of this practice adoption is worthwhile?
Sure. I can think of 2 examples. One isn't going to be cow comfort right away, but the other one will be. Is that okay, Alan? Okay. So the first example, when you can see that things are actually working, once we gave up the plow and we started doing these practices, you could see the earthworms in the soil. You could see the castings, and you could see that the soil felt better. Everyone that was working directly with planting the crops knew things felt better. So there is that example that comes along pretty quickly. But one we saw more recently, we've been experimenting the past 4 or 5 years with planting green, which means leaving that cover crop in place. So there's always something living in the soil, so that you can have that effect on erosion, rain damage, that kind of thing. So the first time we experimented with that, we had a field and we had planted all of it normally. We'd killed the cover crop, planted everything but a strip, and we left the cover crop living in that strip. So in terms of taking risk, it was a small risk, but it was a great example because right after we planted this field, the corn, we had one of those rainstorms where you get 3 inches in an hour. And this field, which was not necessarily a field that had a lot of slope to it, you could see the water running across it. And then when it got to that green strip, everything stopped. And when we saw that, we said, okay, we know this is a practice we need to adopt. And so last year, we planted everything green. We're still learning. There's still challenges with that, but we know it's an important thing. And again, to Scott's point, you can't, every year is going to be different. So you have to look and say, okay, this year we're going to be able to plant everything green. Another year where the spring is late, maybe you can't, but you have ideals that you're working towards with those goals. So that would be, I'm going to have one more example. I guess that was two already. My third one is about comfort. Okay, so this third one is kind of more talking about what we do with our natural fertilizer, manure. So we know this is a really valuable resource for us. And for many farms this year, boy, you want to have your own homegrown fertilizer based on what the prices are of making synthetic fertilizer. So we know we can't use manure all year because plants don't need it all year. So we have a storage that we built about 30 years ago where we'll store the manure for the times that we can't use it effectively on the fields because we want those nutrients to go towards the crops. This is an engineered designed storage. And one of the other things we know that was going on with this storage is that it was emitting methane, which is a greenhouse gas. It's not the worst greenhouse gas because it actually does come back and help crops in the end, but it is a greenhouse gas. And we figured about 150,000 kilograms of methane being produced by this storage every year. Cow comfort was another great issue on our farm, and also the number of inputs we were bringing onto our farm. We every year fill out Corrine Kettering's study on balancing our nutrients, and we could see that we wanted to balance the inputs coming on the farm, say the feed we were buying, the sawdust we were buying to bed our cows, with the outputs, our outputs being our milk and our manure, things like that. And we've done this study for probably 20 years. And each year it's a goal to see if we can balance correctly. And we realized that buying sawdust was not a great way to balance. Sawdust, cows can rest on it. It's not reliably clean. So you never know if it's going to give your cows a disease you don't want them to have. Sometimes it's dirty, sometimes there's not enough. So thinking, how can we make something that's going to benefit our nutrient balance and benefit our cows? So we bought a manure separation system. And basically what that is, it takes the liquid portion out of the manure the cows are making and leaves this nice, really soft, fluffy, natural fiber that the cows can lay on and rest on. So we had this great ability now to make this homegrown bedding for the cows too. And then the nutrients we need to put on the fields were being put into that storage still. And then we had solved two problems. We still had the methane emission, and plus this open storage. We were getting, if you live where we do, about 34 inches of rain every year. And that rain was falling into that open storage, this nice, clean, fresh water that didn't need to be in there, which meant more hauling of that water to fields and diluting of the fertilizer we had. So we took advantage of a New York State program to put a cover on our storage. New York State funded 70% of that cover. And that has been a wonderful benefit. That rainwater is clean. It's not going in the storage. We're capturing all that methane, flaring it off, and we have this great fiber for the cows to lay on. So it's been a super win all the way around. And I think I have to look, I wrote down how many gallons, 3.5 million gallons of fresh water every year not going into the manure storage. So that's been a good one for us.
Yeah, no, that's really, it brings it home and clarifies what are we trying to accomplish at the farm level. And I'm curious, AJ, if you could share a little bit about Indigo Beyond Carbon, right? So that there is a carbon focus in your work, but I understand that it's also about some of the things Megan mentioned, which is soil resilience. Can you talk about some of the other outcomes that you're seeing as clearly significant and important to your partners?
Yeah, one thing, I'll emphasize that the carbon markets are ready now. They're there, and there's a lot of noise there, but and as a side though, I think there's several good questions that to ask if you're either a farmer interested in participating or a buyer interested in buying. Where to understand what is the difference and how do you identify what's a high quality program that really provides you the right kinds of securities there. But one of the core that we've invested in is doing carbon right required really understanding the full ecosystem right? Understanding how the soil is interacting with the plants, how it's all interacting together. And doing that means you understand how the rest of the ecosystem is working as well. And so things like soil erosion, things like water are all part of that story. And, we see that as part of the co-benefits here, where, some of the stories that, Megan was sharing about, infiltration, we see that, across the country in different places where, when we've had these extreme weather events, you'll have fields just across the street that are under very different management systems that have very different outcomes. And that can be pretty significant, because if that means you can, get out and plant a few days earlier, or, harvest, longer window, those things make a big difference, and really matter to our grower partners.
I love your points about resilience, AJ. It's so true. We've seen that with our cover crops. It puts more soil in that ground so that if we have a dry start to the year, we know that we have that advantage of having the water held in place. So, yeah.
Scott, I know that we're coming up on time soon, but I do want to ask you about the farmland work that you do. And I think when you started, or certainly when Fall Line started, carbon and carbon credits was not the reason that you moved into investing in farmland. What were the drivers, and how have things changed? I think you mentioned now there's incredible interest, but is it carbon interest, or is it what are you looking at as the kind of the drivers, or the reasons that we're seeing that resurgence?
Well, when we look at farmland, either purchasing it or managing it, we're focused on, how much value we can bring to the property. We have to have a return on investment, and we have this goal of topsoil preservation or enhancement. And so if it fits into the carbon market, that's great. If it certainly should qualify for ESG credits or potential as well. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a company that apparently has finally cracked the code on elemental sulfur, making it more available. And it's a fascinating technology. And they started the conversation off by saying, we're 1/20th the greenhouse gas footprint of ammonium sulfate. That was how they started off, not the economics of it, not the, comparison. And, I wouldn't have had that comment even maybe 6 months ago, certainly a year ago. So on the tech side, this is first and foremost that they're wanting to promote. And I was involved, in my early involvement with soil conservation, I was involved with the carbon markets that were developed in the 90s to do with soil conservation, the Chicago carbon market and so on. And one thing you learn is you want to be certain of what you're getting into. You don't want to sell a credit that limits opportunities later on. You don't want to sell a credit that limits any sort of market premium. If you sell it to some company and then you're trying to sell your product, your commodity, your production for some premium market, and they found out you sold your carbon credit to somebody else. These are things you have to stay on top of before you make a decision. This is an emerging market. There is a lot of potential there, but it is something that you need to really, search out the details before you make a decision. So with our farmland and our portfolio, we're doing what we're going to do, and we're going to see how we fit into these markets.
Well, Megan, I think people can see why I'm excited about the work that we're doing in regenerative agriculture. There is a tendency with my background in entrepreneurship and in finance to kind of come to things with the same hammer you've always been using. Folks and that we've been talking to remind me that sometimes you don't need more technology. Sometimes it's just education and sharing, and you do so much of that. I'm curious if you could say more about what are the low-tech options for accelerating the adoption of these practices?
That's a great question. Well, I think that taking advantage of all the materials Cooperative Extension offers, we have, especially in the winter season when things should be a little bit quieter on the crop side, at least, getting people to those classes. And they're not only offered by Cooperative Extension, but our local seed dealers, all of them offer classes that are on these topics, which are great. American Farmland Trust. It's a little higher tech, but taking advantage of webinars like this, things like that are tools that people can take advantage of even at the farm are important. We take the time with our landowners to have a meeting with them to talk to them about what we're doing as well. So once every couple of years, we bring them together in a room, have a presenter, and we talk to them because we're trying to spread the idea that this is important, much like Scott's doing with their stakeholders. This is why we're doing the kind of agriculture we do, and I hope we want to work with us because of it. We did not go out and buy all no-till equipment. When we got excited about these things, we looked at our stuff, we went to visit other farms, and we modified what we had. Putting down that much cash to buy all no-till was not a viable thing. So having those creative team members that said, I think we can make this, and then work through it. So it doesn't have to be that cost prohibitive to start. I mean, okay, now we've had our planter 12 years. Now we are buying a no-till planter, but we made this one last 12 years. So you can step out on these things and take your time. Like we said, that one strip of living cover crop, that wasn't a big deal to do that. Or when we're doing another green study this year with Cornell, looking at 3 different types of practices that we should do before we plant into the green cover crop. It doesn't take much. It just takes a few extra minutes to get that laid out with our team. These are not expensive or high-tech things to do, but it just takes people that are dedicated to trying to make a difference on things and having that goal in place if that's what you want to do.
Wonderful. I'm glad you mentioned that. There is the idea of collaboration, whether with your team on the farm or with American Farmland Trust, or certainly in our case, we're seeing incredible collaboration with soil and water districts and others. So I think that's a really important first step and an opportunity to overcome some of these hurdles together. And you talked earlier about how farmers learn from each other and do things maybe perhaps at a small scale at times. I want to ask Jen if she'll join us to kind of look at some of the questions or comments that we might be seeing online.
Yeah, thanks. We do have a question that I think it would be fascinating to get an answer from each of the panelists' different perspectives. And even Alan, you may have a perspective in this too. It is from Alex, and the question is, how are regenerative ag outcomes being measured? What are the metrics for something like soil health? How are you measuring carbon sequestration, those kinds of things? And Alan, I'll let you kind of steer the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I didn't mention that AJ has a doctorate in physics, so he's going to be able to really give us the best answer on this, but also because of the work that Indigo has been doing. AJ, do you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure, I can start, and I'll start with the second part first in terms of how do we measure carbon sequestration. This is really the big question, right? That's sort of needed to enable these markets. And, the way that we do it is, we use a hybrid, like a mix of both direct soil sampling and measurement with modeling. So there's these biogeochemical models that, basically try to represent all the different interactions that happen in the ecosystem. And, if we can then work with the farmer to understand what was their farm management history before they made a change, and then understand what the change was, we can feed that into the model to estimate, okay, what was the sort of greenhouse gas production? What was the soil being sequestered, in their baseline period? And then now what is the difference between what would have happened if they had continued and if they made that change, to get an estimate of what is actually, new and created that's additional in that case. And, we can use that to do this at a very large scale. And then use soil samples to help true up and calibrate that to make sure that we're staying grounded in reality.
Scott, do you want to kind of talk, you mentioned it briefly earlier, ESG and scope emission. Can you talk a little bit about how you're measuring or how you're kind of interacting with this question?
Yeah, we've actually been evaluating various tools to measure this. And, from a farmer's perspective, it's not something that's top of the radar to know exactly what the carbon is day in and day out. So in a way, we're evaluating what's out there, but in some sense, there probably has to be an agreement in the future as to what the tool will be, what the standard will be. And, on my own farm, 35 years of no-till, I think the organic matter's gone up. It changes depending on the year and those sort of things. So it's a moving target one year to the next in a climate like where we are. But if you keep the topsoil in place, you're going to do good things. And so how we measure that is, I guess, still up for debate as we're evaluating these things. We've had companies that are approaching us about measuring total carbon, like carbonates, and some of our soils have a lot of carbonates. Well, that actually counts to carbon sequestering, and that's kind of a curveball that we weren't even thinking of a year ago. And so I guess the point is it's something that's still evolving within us.
Of course, here at Cornell, we've spent a lot of time, and Megan mentioned Harold Van Ness, and last week I attended his soil health group exactly for this reason, because there is so much research continuing to be done on the measurement of outcomes. I will also say that, especially in practice now, since some of this research takes years to accumulate, we have been seeing a lot of the practitioners move forward with practice, just adopting and measuring the adoption of practice, letting the outcomes get figured out at some point, but knowing that there are some immediate benefits and kind of a longer term commitment and investment that's needed that we need to start now. But of course, as we think about credits and scope 3 emissions, we do need to think about the monitoring and verification, which can be time intensive. And I think it also kind of ties into the fact that some of this work is really for larger farms. And I think that's one of the other barriers or challenges in this work that we're seeing, AJ, Scott, Megan, is how do we get smaller farms or beginning farmers engaged and involved in this kind of work? Any words of wisdom on that front?
I would say one of the innovative programs Cornell brought to our farm last year was a Women in Agriculture, Women of the Land program. So it's women who are landowners or have become beginning farmers to our farm, because sometimes there's a feeling of, discomfort of dealing with maybe seasoned male farmers, and they want to give them that perspective. So I thought that was a neat way to bring smaller or newer farmers, or maybe women who had inherited the land from their spouse who had passed away that had farmed, to see what was going on in different farms, bringing them together to have those conversations, which is a neat thing. And then I think if people are we're farmers that are on the ground, we're seeing those changes and seeing how it's affected the organic matter because we're measuring that. So having other farms come and see that and be part of that, I think is really effective. And to see what our yields are and what farms that are adopting practices, what their yields are, because those are things that farms are looking at too. So I think that sharing is important.
I would add there, Alan, I think it's also about inclusion of the voices as we design and build these programs. I mean, one thing that Indigo did is, early on we had some certain amount of acreage requirements around to be included in the program, and we realized that was potentially going to exclude several key folks, and took feedback and made some changes to how we think about our program eligibility. We also recently started working with the National Indian Carbon Coalition to really work with tribal land members and Native American farmers and ranchers to think about how their needs might be slightly different, and how their work is structured and the land they work on is structured, and to make sure that our programs can work for them as well.
Thanks, AJ. Jen, any other?
Yeah, from Jenna, we have the question about how computerized farming equipment intersects with regenerative agriculture. How is computerized farming equipment affecting farmers, affecting regenerative farming?
One of the neat things that's come out of so we've been tracing our crop records in terms of yields for probably 20 years, mostly by scaling it and then taking notes and putting them into Excel spreadsheets. But we now have a system on our chopper that's recording all those weights. We're putting them into a study with Cornell, and it's generating really neat maps through Korean Kettering that shows in a given field, throughout the field, areas that are always productive, areas that are rarely productive, and areas that are variable. And it's really helping us think about how we should address specific areas of those fields. And that was data that was not available to us. You tended to look at a field as a whole, and now we're really looking at it in very small particles, so we can think more specifically about how to best treat each part of that field. And we couldn't do that without computerized systems.
Great. I have one probably final question. This is from Teresa. Again, I think this is something that everyone can give their perspective on. With the emphasis on soil health, are there incentives for improving farm worker health, community health as foundational within regenerative ag?
I would say you cannot be a successful farmer without having healthy, successful employees. Part of our mission statement is that everyone has to succeed on the farm. We, as part of the training, when you come in the door on our farm, we have safety training on the first day, whether you're working in the parlor or whether you're working out in the field. You have to regard people as whole people when they're coming to work with you, and you have to give them the challenges they need and the remuneration they need and the excitement about the goals we have to make them want to be part of our system.
I think maybe this even ties into the computerized farming side of it too, that, most of the broadacre farmers are, we adapt technology very quickly, and computerized farming is really, I'm not sure, I haven't really heard that term very often, but I think I'm thinking that they're talking of autonomous or that sort of thing, but we're not going to see autonomous agriculture and broadacre farming for quite some time. But we are going to see the ability to spray a product in precisely the right location, or as Megan said, precisely apply inputs where they're going to be used the most efficiently. And this will have an impact over when you're doing very precise application of inputs, there will be less drift, there'll be less off-target application. That should be positive for the community and the worker, to that specific thing. And then in our own work, we're investing in companies that are creating a whole new class of pesticides made from proteins. And so they have no impact on anything other than the target they're going after. It's like if you made a weapon from an icicle and it melts to water a few hours later. This is exactly what we're seeing with a company like Greenlight Bio that's setting up its facility in Rochester. They're creating mRNA products. We're investing in a company that's creating a whole new class of pesticides out of peptides. And the synthetics that we use today will probably not be what we're using 10, 15 years from now.
Great. Thank you all.
Yeah, AJ, I don't know if you have anything you want to add?
I would just say, I think, to answer the last part of that around the community well-being, I think a lot of it's also about how do we make sure that the economic benefits are flowing to the communities that are actually engaged in the agricultural work. And, one of the things that, really is important to us is how we've structured our program to try to be as grower friendly as possible, and also make sure that the incentives and those carbon credits that get sold, the vast majority of that income is, to the grower. And it's set up in a way that, as prices increase, they will share in that growth as we see, I think, an increasing interest in these markets, and we believe that there's going to be a rise in those prices.
Yeah, if we find something new that works well in an area, we'll have a field day because we want the community to do well. That impacts our overall farm value. It's kind of selfish that way, but coming from Extension and being a farmer ourselves, if we find something that works well, we want the whole community to know about it. And we've had several field days over the years talking about some of the interest or new things that we're trying. Because overall, if the community does well, then your farm value will do well.
Great. I can hear your Extension bona fides there, Scott. All right.
It's hard to give that up.
We are at our hour. This is a really great conversation. I'm looking forward to it being on our Grow New York website, and as well as the eCornell website. I'm super grateful to Alan, AJ, Megan, Scott, and the eCornell team. Again, Grow New York plans to open its 4th round of applications in May, and we are accepting applications to our hardware napkin to prototype ag tech accelerator this summer. That will accept those applications through Friday afternoon. Thank you again, and hope to see you at this year's Grow New York Summit in November.
Thank you.
Thanks so.